In the heart of the vast Alaskan wilderness, a lone grizzly bear wandered through the dense forest, her fur matted with blood and her eyes filled with desperation. She had given birth to her cub just a few days earlier, but now the tiny creature lay motionless, its life ebbing away. The bear's cries echoed through the woods, her anguish palpable. She had tried everything she could think of to save her cub, but to no avail. The cub was too weak, too frail, and the bear knew there was nothing more she could do. As her despair deepened, the bear stumbled upon a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was a woman sitting cross-legged on the ground, her eyes closed in meditation. The bear hesitated for a moment, unsure of how the woman would react to her presence. But then, remembering her cub, she knew she had to try. She let out a low growl, and the woman opened her eyes. She looked at the bear, her expression one of compassion. "What is it, bear?" she asked gently. The bear pointed to her cub, who lay motionless on the ground. The woman nodded in understanding. She stood up and walked over to the cub, kneeling down and gently touching its forehead. The cub stirred slightly, its eyes opening. It let out a whimper, and the woman smiled. "It's okay, little one," she said softly. "I'm here to help." The bear watched as the woman picked up the cub and cradled it in her arms. The cub snuggled close to her, its cries subsiding. The woman looked up at the bear and smiled. "Thank you, bear," she said. "You have saved my cub's life." The bear nodded, a look of relief washing over her face. "I will never forget your kindness," she said. The woman smiled again. "I know you won't," she said. "And I will never forget you." With that, the woman turned and walked away, the cub still cradled in her arms. The bear watched her go, a sense of peace washing over her. She knew that her cub was in good hands now. Sarah, the woman, carried the cub back to her cabin, a small wooden structure nestled deep within the forest. She had lived in the Alaskan wilderness for many years, seeking solace and tranquility in the embrace of nature. Sarah laid the cub gently on her bed and examined it closely. The cub was small, even for its age, and its breathing was shallow. Sarah knew it was in critical condition. She quickly gathered some herbs, prepared a poultice, and applied it to the cub's wounds. She wrapped the cub in a warm blanket and held it close to her chest, hoping to transfer some of her own body heat to the tiny creature. Throughout the night, Sarah stayed by the cub's side, monitoring its breathing and whispering words of comfort. She knew the cub's chances of survival were slim, but she refused to give up hope. As the first rays of dawn filtered through the trees, the cub stirred. Sarah held her breath as the cub's eyes fluttered open. It looked up at Sarah, its eyes filled with confusion. Sarah smiled gently and stroked the cub's fur. "It's okay, little one," she said softly. "You're safe now." The cub let out a soft whimper and nuzzled closer to Sarah. Sarah's heart swelled with joy. She had saved the cub's life. Over the next few days, Sarah nursed the cub back to health. She fed it milk from a bottle and kept it warm and comfortable. The cub, which Sarah named Hope, thrived under her care. As Hope grew stronger, Sarah began to take her outside for short periods of time. Hope was fascinated by the world around her and would often scamper off to explore, much to Sarah's amusement. One day, while Sarah and Hope were playing in the clearing, they heard a rustling in the bushes. Sarah turned to see a large grizzly bear emerge from the trees. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She knew this was Hope's mother. The bear approached cautiously, sniffing the air and fixing her eyes on Hope. Sarah held her breath, unsure of what the bear would do. But then, the bear did something unexpected. She gently nudged Hope with her nose as if to say hello. Hope, in turn, nuzzled against the bear's fur. Sarah watched in amazement as the bear and her cub interacted. It was clear they recognized each other. After a few minutes, the bear turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. Hope watched her go, a look of sadness in her eyes. Sarah knelt down and hugged Hope close. "It's okay, Hope," she said softly. "Your mother knows that you're safe now." Hope looked up at Sarah, her eyes filled with trust. Sarah smiled. She knew that she had made a friend for life. Weeks turned into months, and Hope flourished under Sarah's care. She grew bigger and stronger, her playful antics bringing joy to Sarah's solitary life. The cabin, once quiet and still, now echoed with the sounds of Hope's playful growls and the patter of her paws. Sarah found herself talking to Hope constantly, sharing her thoughts and feelings with the cub as if she were a lifelong friend. One evening, as Sarah sat by the fire reading, Hope suddenly became agitated. She paced around the cabin, whining and pawing at the door. Sarah tried to calm her, but Hope was insistent. Finally, Sarah decided to follow Hope outside. The cub led her to the edge of the clearing, where a large male grizzly bear stood waiting. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. This bear was much larger than Hope's mother, and his demeanor was less gentle. Hope ran toward the male bear, who greeted her with a low growl. Sarah watched nervously as the two bears interacted. The male bear seemed to be assessing Hope, sniffing her and nudging her with his nose. After a few tense moments, the male bear turned and walked away, Hope following close behind. Sarah's heart sank. She knew that Hope was leaving with her father, returning to the wild where she belonged. Sarah watched as the two bears disappeared into the trees, tears streaming down her face. She felt a profound sense of loss, as if a part of her had been ripped away. She returned to the cabin, the silence deafening. The fire had died down, leaving the room cold and dark. Sarah curled up on the bed, Hope's scent still lingering on the blankets. Days turned into weeks, and the silence in the cabin grew heavier. Sarah missed Hope terribly. She missed her playful energy, her affectionate cuddles, and the companionship she had brought into her life. One afternoon, as Sarah was chopping wood outside, she heard a familiar sound, a soft whimper coming from the edge of the clearing. She turned to see Hope standing there, looking thinner and somewhat battered, but her eyes still held the same spark of joy. Sarah dropped the axe and ran toward Hope, tears of joy streaming down her face. Hope leaped into Sarah's arms, licking her face and whimpering with delight. Sarah held Hope close, her heart overflowing with love. She didn't know why Hope had returned, but she was overjoyed to have her back. As the sun began to set, Sarah noticed another figure emerge from the trees. It was Hope's mother, her fur matted and scarred. She looked at Sarah with a mixture of gratitude and apology in her eyes. Sarah realized that Hope's mother had been injured, perhaps in a fight with another bear. She had brought Hope back to Sarah, knowing that she would be safe and cared for. Sarah nodded to the mother bear, a silent understanding passing between them. The mother bear turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving Hope with Sarah. Sarah knew that Hope would likely return to the wild someday, but for now, she was content to have her back in her life. Life with Hope back in her life settled into a comfortable routine. The playful cub, now almost a yearling, was bigger and bolder, but no less affectionate. Sarah spent her days teaching Hope the ways of the forest, showing her which berries were safe to eat and which plants to avoid. She even began teaching Hope basic commands like sit and stay, though Hope's obedience was often dependent on her mood. One crisp autumn morning, a sense of unease settled over Sarah. She couldn't place it, but something felt off. The forest seemed unusually quiet, the usual chatter of birds and squirrels replaced by an unsettling stillness. Even Hope seemed to sense the change, her playful energy replaced by a nervous alertness. As Sarah gathered firewood, she noticed a group of ravens circling overhead, their raucous calls echoing through the trees. Ravens were known to be scavengers, often drawn to the scent of death. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. Was something wrong? Later that day, while foraging for berries, Sarah stumbled upon a disturbing sight. A deer carcass lay sprawled on the forest floor, its flesh mangled and partially eaten. The sight sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. This was no ordinary predator. The kill was too brutal, too savage. That night, Sarah lay awake, listening to the sounds of the forest. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent her heart racing. She knew that something was out there, something dangerous. She hugged Hope close, the young bear's warmth offering a small sense of comfort. The next morning, Sarah decided to venture into the nearby village to gather supplies and seek information. Perhaps the villagers had seen something or heard rumors of unusual activity in the forest. The village was abuzz with talk of a rogue bear, a massive male grizzly that had been terrorizing livestock and even threatening humans. The villagers were terrified, and many were afraid to venture into the forest. Sarah listened to their stories with growing concern. Could this rogue bear be the same one that had taken Hope away? Was he now a threat to her and Hope? With a heavy heart, Sarah gathered her supplies and returned to the cabin. She knew she couldn't stay in the village, not with Hope depending on her. But she also knew she couldn't ignore the danger lurking in the forest. As she approached the clearing, Sarah noticed a set of large paw prints in the soft earth. They were much larger than any bear tracks she had seen before. Her heart sank. The rogue bear had been here. Sarah entered the cabin cautiously, her senses on high alert. She found Hope huddled in a corner, whimpering softly. Sarah rushed to her side, checking her for injuries. Thankfully, Hope seemed unharmed. Sarah knew she had to protect Hope, but how? She was just one woman, and the rogue bear was a formidable opponent. She needed a plan, and she needed it fast. The next few days passed in a tense silence. Sarah knew the rogue bear was out there, somewhere in the forest, and she could feel his presence. The once peaceful surroundings now felt ominous, every rustle of the leaves a potential threat. Hope, usually full of energy, had grown quieter, more reserved, sensing the danger that lingered in the air. She no longer ventured far from the cabin, staying close to Sarah at all times. Sarah had to think carefully. She couldn't risk Hope's safety, and she knew that confrontation with the rogue bear would be inevitable. The bear was likely looking for a mate, and Hope was now reaching the age when she could attract his attention. But she wasn't ready. Hope was still so young, so full of life, and Sarah couldn't let her become a target. The days turned to weeks, and Sarah became increasingly vigilant. She spent her time reinforcing the cabin's defenses, making sure all windows and doors were secured. She gathered weapons, an old rifle passed down from her grandfather, and prepared herself for whatever might come. But deep down, she knew that a weapon wouldn't be enough against a bear of that size. One cold evening, after a long day of preparations, Sarah sat by the fire, Hope curled up beside her. She gazed into the flames, wondering if this would be her last peaceful night. She had spent so many years alone in the wilderness, living in harmony with the creatures around her, but now everything was changing. Her peaceful existence was being torn apart by the arrival of this rogue bear. That night, as the wind howled outside, a loud crash broke the silence. Sarah's heart raced. She jumped to her feet, grabbing the rifle and rushing to the door. Hope followed closely behind, her ears perked with fear. Sarah peered through a crack in the door and saw a massive shadow move across the clearing. Her pulse quickened. There it was, the rogue bear, just beyond the trees. The bear was enormous, his massive form moving silently through the forest, his eyes fixed on the cabin. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She had to act quickly. She grabbed Hope and moved to the back of the cabin, where the trees grew thick and close. She would need to lead the bear away from the cabin, keep him distracted long enough for her to escape with Hope. As she moved through the forest, Sarah heard the bear's heavy footsteps behind her, crashing through the underbrush. She tried to stay calm, but every fiber of her being screamed to run. She couldn't let him find them. Hope was depending on her. With a deep breath, Sarah turned and fired a warning shot into the air. The bear roared in response, the sound sending chills down Sarah's spine. She knew that this wasn't just a warning anymore, it was a battle for survival. She had to outsmart him. Sarah's mind raced. She knew the forest well, and she had the advantage of the terrain. She led the bear deeper into the wilderness, weaving through trees and rocks, trying to throw him off her trail. Hope stayed close by, her footsteps barely audible behind Sarah's. The air was thick with tension, every step calculated, every movement deliberate. Hours passed, and Sarah began to wonder if the bear had given up the chase. But then, she heard a rustle ahead, a low growl. The rogue bear had found them again. He was relentless, but Sarah was determined. She had to protect Hope, no matter what it took. She found a narrow ravine and led Hope down into it. The jagged rocks on either side would be difficult for the bear to navigate. She quickly set up a small trap, a series of sharp, pointed branches wedged between the rocks. It was her only chance. As she waited, her breath shallow, Sarah held Hope close. She whispered words of reassurance, though she wasn't sure if she believed them herself. The roar of the bear grew louder, and then, as if sensing the danger ahead, he paused. The bear hesitated for just a moment, long enough for Sarah to spring into action. With a quick motion, she led Hope to safety on the other side of the ravine. The rogue bear, now enraged, charged forward, only to be caught by the trap. The sharp branches pierced his thick hide, and he howled in pain. The bear struggled, but the trap held firm. Sarah didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. She had to get Hope out of there. Hours later, as the moon rose high in the sky, Sarah and Hope made their way back to the cabin. The danger had passed for now, but Sarah knew it wouldn't be long before the rogue bear would recover and return. The wilderness was no longer the safe haven it once was. It had become a battleground. But as she stood at the cabin's door, looking out into the darkened forest, Sarah felt a sense of resolve. She had fought to protect Hope, and she would continue to fight for her. No matter what. The wilderness had been her home for so long, and she wasn't about to let it be taken away from her. With Hope at her side, Sarah knew that together, they could survive anything. The bond between them was unbreakable, and no matter what the future held, they would face it together, no matter how fierce the storm or how dangerous the wilderness. They had each other, and that was enough.